I'm Carly. I am the Water Program Director at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And we've been doing partnered with some of the organizations that Peg named at the start of the program here. The Minnesota River Drainage Collaborative to work on issues in the Minnesota River Basin. So let's get started. All right, so just for an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the basin and some of the opportunities and the challenges that we face here in the Minnesota River Basin. And then I'm going to talk about public waters protections and specifically about a bill that is active this legislative session that's focused on how to ensure that public water protections extend to all waters that meet the definition of a public water in the state. So let's get started with a brief overview of the basin. So Minnesota's namesake river flows approximately 335 miles from Big Stone Lake at the South Dakota border to the Mississippi River in St. Paul. And it drains approximately a 17,000 square mile watershed. It is the largest tributary to the Mississippi River here in the state. And it's an important public water resource for all Minnesotans. It has lots of fisheries, over 80 fish species. It's a popular destination to fish or to paddle the river with this, interested to meet this guy Mark at some point after the last presentation, to view wildlife and to hike on its banks. It's primarily an agricultural land use across the basin, especially corn and soybeans. About 80% of land use in the basin is in cropland. And while the Minnesota is a treasured resource, it does face some significant challenges, so I'm going to summarize those briefly. So this is a graphic from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and it shows that you can group some of the challenges in the basin into four main categories. The increase in runoff, which we got a really good overview of in the last presentation. So river flows in the Minnesota have doubled since the 1950s because of changes in the landscape like increased artificial drainage, less perennial vegetation, more cropland, and loss of those wetlands to hold water on the landscape. And climate change has accelerated these trends even further, though that graphic was really useful to show the relative contribution of climate change versus landscape changes. And then nutrients correlate. You can see that runoff levels increase west to east, and the nutrient levels have that same trend of increase from west to east. So phosphorus and nitrogen in particular are challenges in this watershed. Phosphorus has shown some improvement, mostly because of changes to wastewater treatment plant pollution controls. But nitrogen and specifically nitrate levels do continue to increase. And we do know that agricultural drainage accounts for approximately 70% of nitrogen loads in the Minnesota River. All right, let's see, sediment, I won't go too much further into that. I cannot top what Carrie shared with you already. But we know that the post-glacial history of the basin makes it vulnerable to erosion, but that artificial drainage has dramatically accelerated that process. And the Pollution Control Agency has found that we need sediment reductions of at least 50% to meet water quality goals, not only in the Minnesota River, but also in the South Metro Mississippi where the two rivers meet. So I always think these are cool maps. These are maps of hydric soils, which indicate the presence of wetlands. So the dark areas on these two maps are hydric soils, which you can think of as wetland presence. The map on the left-hand side is from 1860, and the map on the right-hand side is from 1981. So as you can see, much of the Minnesota River Basin was once pocked with thousands of acres of wetlands, many of which have been drained over the last century to make the landscape more agriculturally productive. In fact, we've lost approximately 90% of marshy wetland landscapes that have been converted into cropland in the southern and western areas of the state. And wetlands are important not only because they store water on the landscape, but also because they're natural filters for pollutants like nitrogen. And then, of course, the increase in river flows from altered hydrology has led also to increased erosion and downstream floods. And in some areas of the Minnesota River Valley, the floods and erosion have been so severe that they've destroyed homes and municipal infrastructure, and have also flooded some third-generation farmers out of historically productive cropland. All right, so here's a different picture of the muddy Mississippi, the point where the two rivers meet in St. Paul, the Minnesota and the Mississippi. And I just want to pause here and say, with all of these challenges, it can sometimes feel like the damage has already been done. And it is important to be clear-eyed about the extent of the work that we need to do to meet water quality goals. But what I want to shift to and talk about now is that there are important tools that we can use to protect the Minnesota River and its tributaries. This is especially important right now because there's currently a lot of activity around new proposed drainage projects. As older drainage system infrastructure starts to crumble, a lot of these systems were put in place a long time ago. And also as more land goes into crop production and as climate change increases the intensity and frequency of precipitation. So all of this means that right now we really have a critical opportunity to ensure that our state waters are protected and to rethink how we design drainage in a way that balances agricultural production, which is of course very important to the regional economy here in a basin with 80% of the land in cropland, with the equally critical needs to improve water quality, protect downstream landowners, and enhance resources like wetlands. So there are ways to do both. From wetland restoration to controlled drainage practices that slow water flow and minimize erosion, to conservation drainage practices like bioreactors and saturated buffers that treat and remove nutrients from the discharge. But first and foremost, we really need to design projects in a way that minimizes increases in flow to an already stressed system. That's really a fundamental piece. But to get there, we need to use the tools that we have to review the potential environmental impacts of proposed projects and consider ways to mitigate those impacts at the stage of project design. So what are some of those tools? That was a really long segue to get me into the name of my talk, which is public water protections. So one of those tools is public water protection. So when Minnesota became a state, its waters were transferred to the state to hold in trust on behalf of its citizens. Public waters belong to all of us. And in Minnesota, where water is very central to our identity, the legislature, the state legislature, has taken an expansive view of what counts as a public water and has defined that in state law. So there are two key ways that we define public waters in Minnesota. We have a definition in state law, which is, as I said, an expansive definition, and one thing that it includes is all natural and altered water courses with a drainage area greater than 2 square miles. There is also a county-by-county list and map of public waters called the Public Waters Inventory that was created in the 1980s by the Department of Natural Resources to document public waters in the state. So these are both really important tools. It's important to have a reference document for people to see public waters. But there are some errors currently on the public waters inventory. It leaves off some water, a decent number of waters currently that do meet the definition of public waters in state law. And some of those were deleted in 2017 when about 640 stream miles were removed from the inventory by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. It was around the time of the buffer law. And DNR has since acknowledged that some of the deleted waters should be restored to the inventory and has committed to review and restore waters as appropriate. However, that has definitely proven to be a slow process and has been subject to some lawsuits. For example, Randall County sued to block additions to the inventory. That lawsuit has since been dismissed, but the slow pace of changes to the inventory to adequately reflect all public waters in the state remains an issue. All right, so why does this matter? Why is it important to correctly identify public waters across the state? Minnesota has required permits and categories for environmental review that apply when public waters are impacted. But those tools are only effective if we correctly identify all public waters that those tools apply to. Those tools include the Public Waters Work Permit. That is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Natural Resources. You know, we have some folks from the DNR here in the audience with us today. And under this permit program, the DNR requires a permit before public waters can be ditched, drained, or dammed if it's a significant impact. And DNR hydrologists will review projects with the potential to significantly impact public waters and make sure that steps are taken in the project designed to mitigate those impacts. So that's a really important tool that we have. A second one is mandatory environmental review. So here in Minnesota, we do have mandatory categories for certain types of projects where there must be environmental review before the project moves forward. And one of those is all projects that will change or diminish the course, current, or cross-section of 1 acre or more of public water or public water's wetlands. Those projects must do what's called an environmental assessment worksheet, or an EAW. And the purpose of this worksheet is to determine if the proposed project may have the potential for a significant environmental impact before it moves forward. It's also an important tool to consider the cumulative impact, not just of a single project, but of many projects of the same type. For example, the role of drainage systems and increases in river flow in the Minnesota River and the associated increase in nutrient and sediment loads. So let's give a real-world example, because I've thrown a few different acronyms at you at this point, from the PWI to the EAW. But this is a real-world example of why this matters. So it's a story of a court case around Limbo Creek in Renville County, which is within the Minnesota River watershed. This is one of those water courses that I mentioned earlier that does meet the definition of a public water in state law, but is not currently identified as such on the inventory. So in 2020, my organization, the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, filed a lawsuit on behalf of residents in the Minnesota River Basin to challenge the approval of a drainage project that would significantly impact Limbo Creek, water that met the state definition for a public water, but that project did not go through mandatory environmental review for public water's impacts because the county said it wasn't a public water because it's not on the inventory. So this case went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and in September of 2022, the court ruled that Limbo Creek is a public water, even though it's not correctly listed on the inventory. So this is a really important victory because it meant that the proposed improvement project did need to go through environmental review. And in the wake of that decision, a new proposal has been advanced for that drainage system that would both deal with the backed up drainage and the related agricultural productivity issues and protect Limbo Creek as a public water. So, you know, there are other ways to design these projects, and we've seen a new proposal come forward in Limbo Creek. So in its decision in the Limbo Creek case, the court said this one line that we have quoted extensively since, which is that it is for this broader question of the relationship between the state law definition and the inventory, it is the duty of the legislature to clarify the relationship between the inventory and the statutory definition of public waters. So, this legislative session, MCEA worked with other groups to introduce a bill that does just that. And what it does is it affirms that it's the statutory definition that defines the scope of the state's jurisdiction over public waters. In this picture, Scott Sparlin, who is in the back of the room there with the Coalition for a Clean Minnesota River, testifies in support of the bill with House Author Representative Purcell. This bill formalizes what is already the current internal policy of the Department of Natural Resources and ensures that all public waters in Minnesota are protected. Basically, you know, it has a pretty, it's a pretty common sense fix with the impact of it is that where there are discrepancies for specific water courses between the inventory and the statutory definition, like Limbo Creek, the bill eliminates confusion and provides clarity. It makes sense to do this, especially today when we have a lot of new technologies like LiDAR that make it relatively easy to quickly identify if a given water course meets that definition, for example, has that drainage area greater than 2 square miles. And then finally, I want to say that MCEA does support efforts to make the inventory as accurate as possible. The inventory should continue to be updated so that it can be a useful tool for all stakeholders. So this is a common sense fix that doesn't get in the way of continued updates to the inventory. I will wrap it up here and just say that this step, when we zoom out of Minnesota and look at the big picture, this is a really important time to strengthen our statewide public waters protections because at the federal level, in August of 2023, the federal government weakened the federal definition of waters of the United States after a U.S. Supreme Court decision called Sackett versus EPA. This amended definition narrowed the scope of what waters fall under federal jurisdiction, and the practical effect of that is that isolated wetlands like seasonal potholes and forested peatlands, as well as headwater streams, are no longer protected by federal permits. So this means that our state level protections are more important than ever right now, and it's a good time to make sure that they apply to all public waters. So let's wrap it up here. So just to zoom back out, as Dr. Jennings said in her presentation, there have been a wide range of intended and unintended consequences from decades of intensive agricultural drainage. We've seen increased river flows, we've seen increased erosion and sediment, and increased nutrient loads. And we will not meet our water quality goals in the Minnesota River Basin until we begin to seriously mitigate the impacts from agricultural drainage. That means that right now we have an important opportunity to create more transparency in the drainage process, to strengthen the review of potential environmental impacts, and to rethink how we design drainage systems in ways that can mitigate those impacts. But a really critical first step is to ensure that all public waters are protected in the state so that the necessary permits and environmental review apply. So if you are interested to learn more about this issue, as I said, that bill is currently active this legislative session. My colleagues are over there at the MCEA table. We have some fact sheets about the bill and we'll be happy to talk to you more. Thank you.